Let me take this opportunity to introduce our next session, which focuses on energy and climate policy, the view from DC. And for that purpose, we are delighted to have another of the members of our advisory board, Mona Sutphin, who is a senior advisor with Vistria Group. So as you return to your seats, I will turn over the stage to Mona and to her panel. So please do take your seats right about now. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So first, thrilled to be with you all today. So this is the last panel discussion. So of course they save the best for last. That's us. But in my view, this is going to be a really interesting conversation because like my distinguished panelists here, for those of us who've been dealing with energy, the energy landscape, energy stakeholders, if you've been in Washington, you always get the question like, what is going on in Washington? And sometimes it's a kind of curious, what's going on in Washington? And sometimes it's a, what is going on in Washington, right? And so these guys are going to answer that question today, so that's the best news. So we have a great, wide, diverse views, which is one of the best things about the center is to bring together people who have really diverse views. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I think you might be surprised on some of the topics where people are on them. So first we have George David Banks, goes by David, who's now Executive Vice President at the American Council on Capital Formation. But he most recently served as Special Assistant to the President Trump on international energy and environment policy at the NEC and NSC. We also have Christy Goldfuss, who is formerly CEQ, who's a Senior Vice President for Energy and Environmental Policy at the Center for American Progress. And we also are supposed to have and will have Congressman Curbelo, who is stuck in traffic, I think on his way from LaGuardia, if I'm not mistaken, who most recently was the Republican representative from Florida's 26th Congressional District. And so standing in for now, at least, we have Jason Bordoff, who you all know, and I don't need to introduce. So before we jump into this discussion, I think by now, since we're at the end of the day, you guys know this, but if you have a question, you can tweet it to @ColumbiaUEnergy, or you can use the hashtag CGEP Summit 2019. To me, it's much easier to just text to a telephone number, which is 347-621-7399. So as I said, one of the things I really appreciate about being involved at the center here is the diversity of thought and perspectives that people bring together. And so we're going to tackle a range of topics today, most in the news, really interested in your questions as well. So we're going to kick it off here with my favorite topic du jour, which is the Green New Deal. And I want to start off with this because I've been in Washington, in and out of Washington for 20 years. And as I was telling Jason, I have never seen an issue hit the landscape with so much intensity of response and energy on both sides, given where it is in its evolution as a policy idea. And I've been involved in a lot of really controversial policy, namely Obamacare, but a bunch of other things. It usually takes a while for these things to get quite intense. For some reason, this one is hit a little bit like a neutron bomb in the political environment. And so, but like a lot of these things, the devil is really in the details. I think there's a big question in a lot of people's minds about those details. So one question, when you strip away the bumper sticker headline, maybe Christy, I'll start with you, which is your sense of the salience, which elements of the Green New Deal you think have the most political and policy viability when you strip away the kind of bumper sticker part of it?
Great. Thank you, Mona, for the question. And hello, everyone. Before I get to the specifics, let me just say, having lived through this incredibly shifting landscape in Washington, D.C., and what's happened with the Green New Deal, is it has completely opened up the discussion about climate policy in a way that I can tell you 4 months ago was not happening. And at the highest levels of Congress, and really brought politicians to a place where they want ideas. They want to know what are the solutions. And that's the broad range of solutions, from innovation to regulations to what needs to be happening with the Clean Air Act, every single piece of it. So that advancement of it has been really exciting. I think in the details, as everybody knows, the Green New Deal as it exists now is a resolution. So if it passed tomorrow, there would be literally no change in policy, no change in anything that any company did, any person in their lives. It is a grand vision that really meets the scope of the climate challenge. And that's the first time we've had that in the congressional debate in a long time. And so right after the National Climate Assessment, the IPCC report, and then the California wildfires, there was this vacuum. And messenger matters. So, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and these activists really were perfectly timed after the election to say this is an issue that matters to us. Mm-hmm. Activism is messy. The details will come throughout this Congress, throughout all the discussions that we're going to be having with the new Select Committee, both in the Senate and in the House. So I don't want to sit here and pretend like I can define exactly what those details will be. However, if you focus on the climate portion of the Green New Deal, those targets and that really definition of how we're going to get there is the debate that will happen between now and really the next presidential election.
And it's interesting. I wanted to ask, it's actually a perfect question for David, because underneath this, it does seem like the tectonic plates of the politics are shifting underneath in a pretty profound way. And I'm just curious whether or not you agree with that, meaning you have lots of people come up with lots of bold ideas and they're literally on a piece of paper and nobody ever talks about them again. So to your point, 4 months ago, whatever, now it's something where you're even starting to see, do you expect to see Republican alternatives? Mm-hmm. Even notice this Romney, Alexander effort. To me, that signifies there's a need or a feeling of a need to start responding. Is that a fair way to read through those tea leaves? And do you see that kind of being a full debate on both sides and all that?
Yeah, I think, and by the way, you're a very good salesperson. It almost makes me want to go, oh, I like that. No, you're really good. You're really good.
Because she's for jobs and apple pie and humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree. I think that, it's been a game changer. And I think from my perspective, opening up and sort of restarting a national discussion on climate change, long overdue. And so the Green New Deal certainly made all that happen, because you're right. Before the election, I don't think the vast majority of climate policy dorks, right, would have said, even if the House flips, there's not going to be any kind of real major initiative that flows out of this Congress. Well, we were wrong. And yes, and I really do credit the Green New Deal, at least in part. I'm not going to say it's totally responsible, but at least in part for, I think, some of the change in the way Republicans approach the climate messaging component, particularly in the House leadership, energy and commerce. I'm really pleased with the steps that Republicans have taken on that front. And yes, I do believe that you're going to see more Republicans sort of lean forward with their own ideas, their own proposals. You saw that with the Green Real Deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, which obviously sounds too much like the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's but there was that was mostly focused on innovation. but I do expect more of that to occur. And not just in the House, but in the Senate as well.
Yeah.
But again, mostly focused in the innovation space. You might have some building support for a clean energy standard, or those type of policies and measures as well.
Yeah. And let me ask you, just as a structural matter, and then I want to bring Jason in, because he wrote a really interesting piece about his views of this as well, which is, I'm really skeptical about big pieces of legislation, meaning, ACA style, everything at once. It sounds like basically this is created, it's really interesting because it's creating a conversation around a process. Mm-hmm. Is it going to lead to a bill, you think, or multiple threads that kind of lead to some outcome at some point?
This is where I'm probably too much of an institutionalist and know how Congress works. I don't see how it could be a bill.
Yeah. Right.
Given the areas of jurisdiction and the committees we're talking about and everything that would have to be included in it, it would be enormous. And the Green New Deal is not just about climate. It's about, equity, and it's about healthcare, and it's about jobs and housing, and those are pieces that, in my opinion, are going to be too heavy in terms of how the overall package will come to be. Certainly, as we talk about climate change, we need to look at communities that have really been disadvantaged by traditional pollution. We need to make sure that we're reducing and improving air quality around communities that are close to coal-fired power plants. So there's a lot of intersection between how we look at equity and how we look at climate policy, but I think as the policy comes together, there will be many different pieces in my mind.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would, and I do think, if you look at some of the ideas that in the Green New Deal, one of the more appealing pieces, I think, to Republicans would be the resilient infrastructure, and all the investment that we're going to have to to make. There's, again, growing recognition, climate impacts, flooding, extreme weather events, and already, look, our state and local governments are investing billions and billions of dollars, for this very reason.
Yeah.
And so I think that, some of these pieces, if we can pull it apart, I think have some promise.
Yeah.
I have to give David a hard time. It's always infrastructure week. Infrastructure is something everyone can agree in the Trump administration, right?
We love building stuff, right?
Everybody in government loves building stuff. Nobody wants to pay to build the stuff. That's one of the central issues.
True.
Right? Who gets it and who gets to spend it? So, okay. So, Jason, I'm really curious what you think of this conversation, and because I know you've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
Trying to get past the bumper sticker?
Did not know I would be on this panel, but I have been thinking about the topic a lot and wrote a 6,000-word essay that came out 2 weeks ago or so in Democracy Journal. I think the headline that the authors don't write their own headlines that was chosen, but I think is well chosen, was Getting Real about the Green New Deal. And it said, yes, we need to move urgently, but we've learned a lot about how to do that since World War II. And what that meant was that the Green New Deal has provided a huge amount of value in many ways, and there's a lot to like about it, namely the reminding us of the level of ambition that climate science tells us is necessary. Clearly the visibility it's brought to this issue. I start the article with a reference to Ken Bone, for those energy wonks and nerds who will remember. He was the one red-sweatered person in the last presidential debate who asked a question about energy, because there were no questions about climate for the rest of all the debates in 2016 and no questions about climate for all the debates of 2012. That will not be the case this time. And the level of attention that it brings to issues of not just to environmental justice, to issues of transition with dislocated workers from the energy transition, and issues of economic justice more broadly, which are really important to build the kind of coalition that we need on this. It expressed a couple of concerns, too, and so this is not with the Green New Deal. I mean, this is more the way it is sometimes caricatured on the right, or even the way I sometimes hear people on the left talk about it. There's nothing inherent to the resolution that reflects this. So I'm not criticizing the Green New Deal, but what worried me was when I see people taking it in a direction that presents what I think is a false trade-off between market-based solutions to climate change and World War II-style economic mobilization. The economy we have today is very different from that existed during the Great Depression and World War II. We have a much better set of regulatory tools that were part of the innovation that were put in place during the New Deal. We've learned a lot about how to implement policy that is more cost-effective, and I think we should draw those lessons. Related to that is that I think it's important that we remember that the level of government spending is not the right measure of ambition for policy, in my view, behind the Green New Deal. So the New Deal was a lot about putting government resources and government mobilization and government spending behind it. I think we saw a small version of that with the $90 billion of Obama clean energy stimulus that was passed when I was in the Obama administration. And to be honest, the record of that was mixed. Some of it was quite positive in terms of what it did to move renewable energy forward. Some of it, like home weatherization and incentives to get rid of your inefficient cars or appliances, wasn't that effective. And we've actually learned about the limits of government to spend its way out of a problem well, and I think the energy system we have is one driven by private sector capital. And if we're going to change it, you're going to need policies that shift where private sector capital goes. Yes, we need more government spending. I just don't think that's the top of the list. And then the last thing is that I think having a strong set of policy solutions to the problems of affordable health care and housing and economic inequality are incredibly important. They're not the same as the ideal policy solution to solve the problem of climate change, and you want to be careful about how you conflate them. So I think what that leads me to do, and what I tried to do in the article, was lay out what I think it would look like to give real policy meaning to the ambition of a Green New Deal. We can come back and talk about that, but very quickly I think things that help to transition to a lower carbon economy, I would put a carbon price at the top of the list, but it's not the only thing. There would be other reasons why one might want mandates, subsidies, utility regulation reform. The focus we've talked about today already on CO2 removal, both in land-based and technology-based, non-CO2 gases, methane regulations, and other things, and then a very strong role for government in R&D. And there are some other things that I would add to that as well. But I think now what we need to start doing, to Christy's point, is thinking about details matter, and how do we make sure that we move in a direction where the details really move the needle on a gigaton scale, and we don't get lost in things that may be more symbolic, may be more virtue signaling, may be more popular and easy to pass, but don't actually start to move the needle on emissions.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a good, when you said about the price on carbon, I did want to talk about the carbon tax, so that's a perfect segue into that conversation. So, you see this slow creep move toward acceptability of the carbon tax idea. The center, if you haven't read it, put out a really great piece on the design of a carbon tax, actually how it would work. And for those of you, if you've been in Washington, people often will say, well, why don't you pass an X? Sometimes people don't know what, you need the actual answer. How would it work? What would it do? Et cetera, et cetera. That's different than the uses of the revenue, which is a whole other fight in itself. So I'm just curious, maybe, David, I'll start with you, just to say, I think it's a fairly well-known thing, obviously, that Republicans are generally opposed to taxes, things that start with a T, that generate revenue in this day and age. I'm just curious, though, whether or not you think, since there has been, people are tiptoeing, including even industry support, to the idea of a carbon tax, whether you see that that's something that's, in fact, feasible, likely, and if so, kind of in what time frame?
I think it's a political fantasy.
We agree on
so
this
he's
a
got,
little bit.
yes, I was just going to say, yeah, exactly.
For different
political
reasons,
fantasy,
but yeah.
Right. So that means you don't think
Well,
it's
no, I
viable.
think for the same reasons, actually. I mean, I don't think... So, for example, I know in for Republicans who support the carbon tax, it's conditioned.
Yeah.
It's conditioned on getting litigation and regulatory preemption. You're not going to give that up.
No.
Of course not, right? And so, I can't imagine a credible political scenario where you have that kind of deal. Maybe there could have been a chance for some kind of regulatory preemption with cap and trade, right? 10 years ago.
Back in the day, yep.
But not today. So I see it as a distraction.
You do.
Yes, as a Republican who supports climate mitigation and adaptation, it's hard enough to get the Republican Party on board the climate agenda. And it's hard enough, and let's face it, I mean, there's a big chunk of the base that's skeptical, right? And so asking the base to support a tax, right, that would supposedly address climate change, it's too much. It's just, again, it's not politically viable.
So you think what's going to end up happening then, it'll be a little bit like infrastructure, meaning people are for it, but they're for it in a way that makes it impossible to get to, or you think Republicans won't even get to the idea of it?
Well, I do.
Some will.
So let me back up a little bit. I do think there's the possibility of a carbon tax, but not in the way that we're talking about it
now,
right? I see. So let me try to pretend to be a Democratic political operative here. All right?
Okay, yeah, go for it.
I mean, you basically were.
I like this.
Oh, My God.
He was in the Bush administration. Long story, yeah.
I don't know about you now. Anyway, so let me put myself in that person's shoes. Look, I'm going to look at it and go, this is going to be easy, because once we get a critical mass of support for the idea of a carbon tax, right, then let's hijack it and use it to bail out Social Security. And there's no Republican.
Or infrastructure.
Right. Well, Social Security is a much tougher issue,
yes,
right?
That's true.
That has obviously a tremendous amount of political muscle and weight. And there's no Republican who will then vote against saving Social Security because they're not getting regulatory or litigation preemption. So so if we're looking at a likely political scenario that would result in the carbon tax, it's something like that.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be a large carbon tax.
Like revenue generation, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think there are carbon taxes around the world, and we don't have a model that shows it's going to get us the type of emissions reductions we want, or that it holds. And then politically in Washington State, I know Governor Inslee was here earlier. I mean, they tried twice, and then even tried to get it through the legislature, and were unsuccessful. So we don't really have a model to point to. And in the shifting landscape of climate policy, it's also now very much believed that there's no silver bullet. So if a carbon tax isn't going to get you the emissions reductions that you want in the transportation sector, because it could never be high enough that anyone would ever, or it would have to be so high no one would agree to it, then it just becomes is it a pay-for infrastructure?
Right.
Or is it a pay-for some of the other pieces that we would need? But that's a very different discussion than using it to actually drive down emissions.
Right.
And so I think as we're sort of working through what are the targets, what are the big picture actually politically salient ideas out there. And again, if you look to the states, I think we've seen in California, and now governors in New Mexico and Minnesota and in Wisconsin have started to put out big goals about 100% clean energy. Most of the time they're focused on electricity, but those goals are very quiet on the how and very much focused on the what we need to do. And similarly in California, Governor Brown, there was SB 100, but then he had an accompanying executive order that addressed the rest of the economy. And they were silent on the how around CCS or nuclear or some of the political fault lines, but said this is where we need to go. And that gives you a signal. That then tells the agencies what they have to do. And then there's a much longer discussion about what are the tools that get you there.
Yeah. And Jason, do you want to jump in and defend the carbon tax?
We've invested.
And by the way, this is bipartisan consensus, so this is what this looks like. Different reasons, obviously.
At the Center on Global Energy Policy, we've prioritized a couple of areas of our climate change work, and design and implementation issues around a carbon tax are one of those, because I do think we have a view that it is, as most economists think, a powerful tool, the most cost-effective tool. And the question of, should you spend any time researching it or talking about it because it's not politically viable, I find a funny conversation to have, because I'm not looking out there and seeing a bunch of other things that are politically viable that get us anywhere close to where we need to be. So the question is not is a carbon tax today going to pass Congress? I don't think it's going to pass Congress. What I'm thinking about is a world where something changes in the political landscape that makes it that there is real desire among policymakers to put in place policies that achieve really deep reductions in carbon emissions over time. And then in that changed political world, which we don't have right now, do we think a carbon tax makes sense and is going to be a key policy to look at? And I think the answer is yes. I think a carbon tax first does more than many people realize. We've done some modeling around this, and there's all these assumptions that go into models. And as Christy said, when you actually put this into place in the real world, like with any other policy, by the way, they don't necessarily work as efficiently as you would think they would, and different trade-offs are made for the political stuff you have to do to get it passed that minimize the effectiveness, or you have certain carve-outs. But a broadly based economy-wide carbon tax of $50 a ton by 2030 would reduce emissions somewhere around 35 to 40% relative to their 2005 levels. And what a carbon tax does is that other policies don't do, like we want 100% renewable energy, it sends a signal to consumers, so you also hit the demand side. Now that's part of the reason it's not as popular, because consumers see that price signal. It also, energy, we tend to focus on the things in the energy sector that are most salient. We kind of get electric cars and we see cars. We understand the power sector and we know what the alternative, so that's where the mandates come in. We should have electric cars and subsidies for it. We should have mandates for electricity, energy, renewable energy, or nuclear, or whatever. That's less than half of emissions. Emissions come from lots of nooks and crannies of how our economy operates every day that we don't even really appreciate and understand, and policymakers certainly don't. A really economy-wide carbon tax hits all of those in a way that's hard for other policies to do. And the last thing I would say is how you design other policies that may be more politically viable, like a mandate that a certain amount of electricity comes from renewable energy. Well, okay, having a goal is one thing, but how do you actually affect that goal, bring it into being? You actually need a system, a policy, a set of tradable permits that people can use, and you want to make those technology neutral. So maybe it's CCUS, maybe it's nuclear, maybe it's renewable energy. If you design that system in the right way, you're achieving something pretty close to what a carbon tax would do, which is send a price signal to people. And so I think the research about why a carbon tax makes sense can be really useful in thinking about how to design policies that will be called something else to mimic that sort of market-based response.
Mm-hmm. So you guys convinced?
Well, once again, you look at the states, and we have renewable portfolio standards in 29 states. We have other examples that have really worked to kind of...
In the power sector, yes.
In the power sector,
right.
Yeah.
And you have a cap and trade system in California with a very low permit price, in part because there's a series of other mandates and regulations on top of it that determine where the reduction should come from and depress the carbon price.
Right, that mimic what a carbon tax does, but are not a carbon tax in and of themselves. So I guess if we want the results of a carbon tax, but understand that the politics of a carbon tax and even the results internationally bring up questions about how effective it's going to be, I think that's where we have to look at what has worked, what are they doing out in the states, and what is that sort of mix of solutions that get us there. And certainly a price on carbon is key to to the entire system working. It's just how you get at it.
Let me just say one other quick thing, which is I think it is important to look at what's most cost effective, but not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know that the second, third, and probably 10th best solutions are still cheaper than the cost of climate change and the cost of climate impacts. So I want to say that. I do think cost effectiveness matters in terms of sustaining political support, especially as you climb deeper and deeper down the abatement curve. So not a 10 or 20 or 30% reduction, but if we're talking about 50 or 80% reductions, those costs start to build up on economies. And you see in a place like, I would say, Germany, which has the highest electricity tariffs in Europe, isn't seeing emissions going down. There's a backlash among consumers to paying those tariffs. Maybe people will incur some cost if they see it's having an impact. So I do think thinking about cost effectiveness becomes important to maintain political support for policies over time as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll just say one quick thing. Even from a climate mitigation perspective, oftentimes here, when we're talking about national policies and measures, including the carbon tax, we lose the global piece, right? We start focusing on these territorial policies and measures that aren't going to be effective in driving global emissions downward, right? And so, again, I think it's a distraction politically, and I think it's a distraction just from a policy perspective.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to dig a little bit more deeply in terms of parochialness. You just gave me my 10-minute window. Bummer.
My goodness.
Yeah, I know.
We're
We've got
having
lots to talk about. But I did want to say, though, one thing about it is, though, super important. I think people want to see that big powers like the United States can actually move the needle, move the baton forward. And it's got a huge signal and gives a lot of throw weight. And if we're not doing it, clearly nobody else is. So we have to do. I mean, our system is totally different than a lot of other places, and their tools are different and all the rest. So that's
yes, but this is why we need to be innovative when it comes to a global policy framework.
Yeah, totally
that
agree
brings in trade and investment.
Totally agree.
Right?
Yes, completely. Can we get going to the parochial? I did want to talk a little bit about the CAFE standard and the kind of what's going on with the waiver. Mm-hmm. To me, I just look at it and I think, okay, this dispute just means a lot more extended uncertainty for basically everybody, and particularly the auto industry, obviously. I'll ask you, David, a political question, which is I just don't quite understand the thinking behind it. And then maybe, Christy, for you is, are we ever going to get back to a national standard, or should we assume that that was a kind of one window because of the unique circumstances related to the recession and the ability to get everybody on one page? And now that we've lost that, we're more in a kind of state-federal fight that's really a structural change in the way we should think about how that kind of policy is likely to move forward going forward. So first, just the politics of it.
So I'm not an expert on these sort of domestic regulatory issues.
Okay, yes, I know.
So
okay, all right, so we'll give you a pass.
You just from what I've seen, and just given where the president is, and where the team started from, and from the regulatory rollback, regulatory reform agenda, which is a major component of the president's economic policy, and But
in theory, to help industry, right?
Yes. Well,
so when you
so
get
this is
to
the
the point
question.
where the industry is going, okay, this is actually creating a level of uncertainty here at a moment in this industry where
Right.
It seems kind of
Right, and again, I'm not familiar with some of the details behind all of it, but there's, look, from at least at the beginning, there were a lot of complaints from the auto companies.
Yes, exactly. People doing this.
So I think
Right.
so I'm not. Again, I wasn't involved in sort of that policy process and how it all developed, but I think you can make the argument from a Republican perspective that the previous administration overreached on the regulatory side, right? And maybe now it's the extreme has happened where we've overreached on the other side.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that balance is.
Yeah, so that actually is a good segue to Christy. Do you think we'll get back to a place where people go, okay, this doesn't make sense to have multi-state, different standards, copycat states, whatever?
Yeah, it's hard
Or
to
just get
look
used
into
to
the
it.
future right now with everything changing so much. Much of the discussion has moved to zero-emission vehicles. And is there a way through the Clean Air Act or through the standards that were set before that we would actually have some sort of targets around ZEV mandate or something along those lines? I think that would probably take congressional action. So I think we're going to be in this weird dynamic where presidential candidates especially are going to have to say what they're going to do beyond what President Obama did. If there's just put it back in place, that's not that easy to do. Regulations are hard to write, and the uncertainty for industry is real. So I think this is not a clean answer. I don't know, but it has been a very interesting dynamic to have the auto industry out there saying that this really is going to complicate their lives. We have China really moving forward with electric vehicles and the question around storage and batteries. So, I don't know where we will be 2 years from now, and if there is a change in administration, what the political backlash could be and what sort of door that opens up to. It seems odd to me that we would just put everything back. I think we will be at a different time and place. The realities of climate change are before people's eyes now. This is not just a theoretical problem that we're going to have to address in the future. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to demand different solutions.
Yeah. So we're going to move to a couple questions from the audience. So one is, which is kind of an interesting one maybe for everybody, which is how about a rewards-based carbon pricing scheme instead of punishment-based? So more of a supply-side carbon tax cut on clean capital investments. So more of an, you know what I mean? So
I guess my reaction to that would be...
So carrots and not
Yeah, which has a
stick.
revenue, has a fiscal implication, right? So
They all do.
If you subsidize something enough, you can get people to change their behavior and do something in a certain way. I forget exactly, it was a punishment-based or what?
Yeah,
was it?
so instead of a tax, it's an incentive.
But I just want to say, I didn't say this before when I was talking about a carbon tax, whether it is punishment-based depends entirely on what you do with the revenue. So I think that often gets left out of the conversation. And when you look at different ways to use the revenue to rebate it to consumers, to lower payroll taxes, or to do other things, it can actually be quite a progressive policy, and it can actually give people a stake financially in that policy continuing to exist and move forward. So
I think the question is, though, like an incentive that would just like try to move money, like investment dollars into a particular direction instead. I mean, so I'm assuming I have a more heavily subsidized scheme than some of the things we've had in place to date.
Rather than a sort of eat your peas and carrots,
correct, and then figure out how to divide it all up after.
You know, what is the way for people to feel real ownership and constituencies to actually see that this matters in their lives?
Well, just the foundation. I mean, if you think about investment capital, just knowing that, okay, this is something that's really going to be a durable shift in the way that we're going to be rewarded. Because as you know, as the policies change all the time, it's hard to make these kinds of long-term investments when you're not exactly sure how it's going to be treated, right? So in that sense, I think giving some confidence that this is what we're going to do, and it's going to become a durable feature, just like Social Security tax or whatever. Nobody's ever talking about that again, right? So, I'm just.
But carrots come from somewhere,
yes.
and you're.
Yes.
There is tax revenue for them at some point. So.
Yes. No, it's true. It's true. Interestingly, there are like 3 questions about the likelihood of a grand bargain of some sort, which is really like a Green New Deal, coming back to that question. And the one scenario that I could see actually bigger policy moving through is a little bit like the financial crisis, is a recession-driven, so a combination of a recession, climate effects, need for revenue, drive kind of all at the same time, where a lot of stuff gets put on the table, maybe a Social Security trust fund kind of challenge, like a lot of stuff gets done, gets on the table at the same time. Do you see that as like, I'm not sure it would be climate driven at that point though, it might just be revenue driven, more broadly defined. Thoughts on that? You see like, or you think we're so polarized there's no grand bargain on anything? We can't even keep the government open, so let's be clear about our.
No, I mean, I think there's a potential bargain, but we have to. I think we have to think about climate policy differently than we do today, right? I mean, we have to. There's a reason why we don't have a national consensus, and we can. That's another topic for another hour and a half panel or something, right?
Yeah.
But I think that for just really fast. I mean, I've used the EU model. As an example, there's the Europeans from a political perspective were incredibly successful in pulling together a continent-wide climate policy, and they did that through a bottom-up approach, and where they treated member states differently depending on their wealth, their economic and energy circumstances. We need to do that in the United States, right? In a more political, open way. I know we sort of do that in our regulatory conversations. Yeah. But that's between us, regulatory wonks, which I guess I'm not. But we need to do that politically. Yeah.
It's the big question in Washington, D.C. Will there be a moment around budget reconciliation if Democrats take back the Senate and the House and the presidency, which is a big, giant if, or even if Republicans are still in control, but there's this opportunity. I think it's hard to see absent real political pressure. And you said a recession and something that really drives people to believe this is something we have to address. And I mean, that's where the activism is exciting, because it then pushes the middle to look for solutions. And so once that roar gets loud enough, then Republicans and Democrats have to say, what is the solution here? So ultimately, yes, there is going to have to be a big grand bargain. And the question is going to be, will it be in 2 years? Will it be in 6 years, or whatever the even-numbered year is? I would guess it's going to be an even-numbered year. When is that grand bargain going to happen? And what other shifts in our political system will we need to see before that happens?
Yeah. Okay, I got the big stop sign. I just wanted to thank, we didn't even get to my other couple of topics, but that's fine. We'll have to come back and do it again next year, I hope. So will everyone in the audience just thank the panelists for me, and then we'll move on to the last session.